The morning of June 4th, 1940 dawned with deceptive tranquility over the vast Pacific waters surrounding Midway Atoll. Captain Miles Browning stood on the bridge of the USS Enterprise, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he scanned the horizon through salt-crusted binoculars. The wind carried with it the scent of impending storm, not the meteorological kind, but the tempest of war that would forever alter the course of World War II in the Pacific. 6 months had passed since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese Navy had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami. Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines all had fallen to the rising sun's relentless advance. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier strike force, the same fleet that had brought America to its knees at Pearl Harbor, was now bearing down on Midway with four massive aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their mission was clear: capture the strategic atoll and draw the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle that would secure Japanese dominance across the Pacific. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had other plans. Intelligence reports, painstakingly decoded from intercepted Japanese communications, had revealed the enemy's intentions. The Americans knew the Japanese were coming, and they were ready to spring a trap that would either save the Pacific or witness the final destruction of American naval power in the region. Browning adjusted his cap against the stiffening breeze and reflected on the enormity of what lay ahead. The American force was significantly outnumbered, 3 carriers against 4. Fewer experienced pilots and equipment that had seen better days. The USS Yorktown, hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea, bore the scars of previous engagements and really should have spent months in dry dock. Yet here she was, steaming toward what many believed would be America's last stand in the Pacific. On the flight deck below, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron gathered his torpedo bomber squadron around him. The men of Torpedo Squadron 8 looked too young for the hell they were about to enter. Waldron, a part Cherokee pilot from South Dakota, had trained these boys himself, and he knew that the antiquated Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers they flew were death traps against the Zero fighters that protected the Japanese fleet. According to declassified documents from the Naval History and Heritage Command, the American intelligence breakthrough that made the Battle of Midway possible was one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. Codebreakers at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor had cracked enough of the Japanese naval code to determine not only that Midway was the target, but also the timing and composition of the attacking force. The morning air crackled with tension as flight crews made their final preparations. Mechanics worked frantically to ensure every aircraft was combat-ready, while pilots studied their charts one last time, memorizing the coordinates that might mean the difference between victory and annihilation. The younger aviators tried to hide their nervousness behind forced jokes and casual banter, but the veterans remained grimly silent, knowing that many of the faces around them would not see another sunset. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, radar operators aboard the American ships began reporting contacts to the northwest. The Japanese were coming, their massive fleet hidden beyond the horizon, but steadily approaching the killing ground where destiny would be decided. The trap was set. Now came the waiting. At 0600 hours on June 4th, the stillness of dawn shattered like glass against steel. Commander Clarence McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, felt his stomach tighten as the radio crackled with urgent reports from Midway's radar station. Large formation approaching from northwest, distance 150 miles. The Japanese had been spotted, and the deadly chess match was about to begin. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from aboard Enterprise, made the crucial decision to launch his strike immediately. The carriers turned into the wind, their flight decks erupting into controlled chaos as fuel lines snaked across the wooden planking, and ordnancemen wheeled bombs and torpedoes toward waiting aircraft. The smell of aviation gasoline mixed with salt spray and curdite filled the air as engines roared to life. Meanwhile, Admiral Nagumo's four carriers were launching their own strike against Midway. 108 aircraft dive bombers, torpedo planes, and Zero fighters screamed off the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, bound for the American-held atoll. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the formation, confident that this would be another easy victory for the Imperial Navy. But Nagumo faced a dilemma that would prove fatal. Half his aircraft were armed for attacking ships, while the other half carried bombs designed for land targets. When his reconnaissance planes failed to immediately locate the American fleet, he made the decision to rearm his ship attack aircraft with land bombs for a second strike on Midway. It was a choice that would cost him precious time the Americans desperately needed. The first American attack came from Midway itself. Captain William Collins led 16 Marine dive bombers off the tiny runway, their engines straining under the weight of 1,000-pound bombs. Behind them came 4 Army B-26 Marauder bombers, flying so low they nearly skimmed the wave tops. The Marines, flying obsolete Vindicator dive bombers, knew they were heading into a massacre, but they climbed toward the Japanese fleet with grim determination. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, led by veteran pilots who had fought over Pearl Harbor and the Dutch East Indies, tore into the attackers like wolves among sheep. Zero fighters, with their superior maneuverability and experienced pilots, sent Marine aircraft plummeting toward the ocean in flames. Of the 16 Marine dive bombers, only half returned to Midway, and most of those were shot full of holes. The B-26 bombers fared little better, their low-level attack proving futile against the alerted Japanese defenses. At 0730 hours, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's torpedo squadron had approached the Japanese fleet. Waldron had ignored orders to coordinate with the dive bombers and had instead flown directly toward where he believed the enemy carriers would be. His intuition proved correct, but the cost would be terrible. The 15 Devastator torpedo bombers, flying low and slow as they lined up for their attack runs, were sitting ducks for the swarming Zeros. One by one, the American torpedo bombers fell from the sky. Waldron's aircraft was among the first hit, cartwheeling into the ocean in a ball of flame. Ensign George Gay, the squadron's sole survivor, watched in horror as his squadron mates died around him. His own aircraft, riddled with bullets, crashed into the sea just short of the Japanese fleet. Gay would spend the next 30 hours floating in the Pacific, hidden beneath a life raft cushion, witnessing the greatest naval battle in history unfold above him. The Japanese sailors aboard the carriers cheered as the last American torpedo bomber splashed into the ocean. They had beaten off 3 separate attacks without suffering a single hit on their precious carriers. Admiral Nagumo began to believe that this would be as easy as Pearl Harbor had been. His confidence was about to be shattered in the most devastating way possible. High above the Japanese fleet, invisible against the bright morning sky, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled with 37 dive bombers from Enterprise, searching for the enemy carriers that intelligence had promised would be there. At 10:24 a.m. on June 4th, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey made the decision that would change the course of the Pacific War, flying at 14,000 feet above the seemingly empty ocean. His fuel gauges showing dangerously low levels. McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward, its wake cutting a white line through the blue water. The ship was the Arashi, hurrying to rejoin Admiral Nagumo's carrier force after depth-charging what its crew believed was an American submarine. McCluskey made the critical choice to follow the destroyer's wake. Within minutes, the most powerful naval force in the Pacific spread out below his dive bombers, like toys in a bathtub. For aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu steamed in formation, their flight decks, crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The timing could not have been more perfect. Admiral Nagumo had just received word that American ships had been spotted to the northeast. The Japanese admiral, realizing he faced a naval battle rather than just another strike on a land target, had ordered his aircraft to be rearmed once again, this time with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacking ships. The carrier decks were a chaos of fuel lines, ammunition, and aircraft in various stages of preparation. Damage control crews had violated safety protocols, stacking bombs and torpedoes on the hangar decks to speed the rearming process. McCluskey wasted no time. He rolled his dauntless dive bomber into a 70-degree dive, aiming for the largest carrier in sight, the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. Behind him, 36 more dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown followed him down, their engines screaming as they plunged toward the unsuspecting Japanese fleet. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. The Combat Air Patrol had been drawn down to sea level by the earlier torpedo attacks, and the few Zeros at altitude were too far away to intercept the diving Americans. Anti-aircraft fire began to pepper the sky, but it was too little, too late. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, leading the 2nd section of dive bombers, selected Akagi as his target. His 1,000-pound bomb struck the carrier just behind the bridge, penetrating to the upper hangar deck, where it exploded among the aircraft being rearmed. Aviation. Gasoline ignited in a massive fireball that raced through the ship's interior, turning the pride of the Imperial Navy into a floating inferno. Exploding ammunition and aviation fuel created secondary explosions that could be seen for miles, sending pillars of black smoke high into the tropical sky. The attack from Yorktown's dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, focused on the carrier Soryu. 3 direct hits turned the ship into another funeral pyre, her aircraft and aviation fuel creating an inferno that made firefighting impossible. Within 20 minutes of the first bomb hit, all 3 Japanese carriers were blazing wrecks, their proud battle flags hanging limp in the smoke-filled air. On the bridge of Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood in stunned silence, watching his flagship burn around him. The confidence that had carried the Japanese Navy from Pearl Harbor to the coral reefs of the Central Pacific had been shattered in 5 minutes of devastating American dive bombing. His staff officers urged him to transfer his flag to another ship, but Nagumo seemed paralyzed by the disaster unfolding before his eyes. Captain Taijiro Aoki, Akagi's commanding officer, finally ordered his admiral to abandon the burning carrier. As Nagumo and his staff climbed down to a waiting destroyer, explosions continued to rock the ship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The rising sun that had seemed so unstoppable was suddenly setting in flames and smoke across the Pacific battlefield. But the battle was far from over. 1 Japanese carrier remained operational, and its admiral was already planning his revenge. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the carrier Hiryu, the only Japanese flat top still operational after the devastating American dive bomber attack. Unlike his superior Nagumo, who had been paralyzed by the disaster befalling his fleet, Yamaguchi was a man of action. Within minutes of watching his fellow carriers transform into floating pyres, he was already planning his counterstrike. "Launch everything we have," Yamaguchi ordered his flight operations officer. The admiral knew that Hiryu was now the sole hope of salvaging something from what had begun as a certain victory. If he could locate and destroy even 1 American carrier, the battle might still be salvageable. His staff worked frantically to prepare every available aircraft for immediate launch. At 1100 hours, 18 Aichi dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters roared off Hiryu's flight deck, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. The Japanese pilots, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor and the campaigns in the Dutch East Indies, flew with the desperate fury of men who knew their empire's fate hung in the balance. They had studied aerial photographs of American carriers captured during earlier battles, and they knew exactly what to look for. The Americans had not emerged from their victory unscathed. The USS Yorktown, already damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea and hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor, had been spotted by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. The carrier was steaming alone, separated from Enterprise and Hornet by several miles of open ocean. To the Japanese pilots approaching from the northwest, she looked like a perfect target. Captain Elliot Buckmaster commanded Yorktown with the steady competence that had made him one of the Navy's most respected carrier skippers. When radar operators reported incoming aircraft at bearing 320 degrees, Buckmaster immediately ordered general quarters. The familiar alarm echoed throughout the ship as sailors raced to battle stations they had manned so many times before. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley led Yorktown's combat air patrol in there, Grumman Wildcats, climbing to intercept the incoming Japanese strike. The Wildcats were outmatched by the nimble Zeros in a turning fight, but American pilots had learned to use their aircraft's superior diving speed and armor to their advantage. The sky above Yorktown erupted into a swirling dogfight as 18 Wildcats engaged the Japanese escort fighters. Despite the fierce defensive effort, several Japanese dive bombers broke through the combat air patrol. Lieutenant Kobayashi, leading the attack, selected Yorktown's flight deck as his aiming point. His 1,000-pound bomb struck just forward of the island's superstructure, penetrating 3 decks before exploding in the ship's interior. The blast killed dozens of sailors and started fires that sent smoke billowing across the flight deck. 2 more bombs hit in quick succession, one striking near the ship's forward elevator and another penetrating to the 4th deck. The explosions knocked out several boiler rooms, reducing Yorktown's speed to 6 knots and filling her lower decks with smoke and steam. Damage control parties raced through smoke-filled passageways, fighting fires and plugging holes while the ship continued to take punishment. But Yorktown's crew was among the finest in the Pacific Fleet. Damage Control Officer Commander Clarence Aldrich organized repair parties with the precision of a symphony conductor, directing the flow of men and equipment to the most critical areas. Within an hour, the fires were under control and the ship was making 20 knots again. To Japanese reconnaissance pilots observing from a distance, it appeared that Yorktown had been repaired with miraculous speed. This illusion would prove costly for the Japanese. When Admiral Yamaguchi received reports that the American carrier was operational again, he assumed his pilots had encountered a second, undamaged carrier. Believing he faced two American flat tops instead of one, he ordered a second strike with every remaining aircraft on Hiryu. At 1430 hours, 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters launched from Hiryu's deck. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the morning strike against Midway and had returned wounded from anti-aircraft fire, insisted on leading this final attack despite his injuries. His aircraft still showed bullet holes from the morning mission, and his fuel tank had been damaged, but Tominaga was determined to strike one more blow for the Emperor. The second Japanese attack found Yorktown still struggling with damage from the first strike. This time, the torpedo bombers came in low and fast, their sleek Nakajima aircraft skimming just above the wave tops as they approached the carrier's port side. Despite intense anti-aircraft fire that filled the air with deadly shrapnel, the torpedoes found their mark. The explosions below Yorktown's waterline were catastrophic, flooding her port side and causing a dangerous list that made flight operations impossible. The USS Yorktown lay dead in the water, listing heavily to port as damage control teams fought desperately to save the carrier. Black smoke poured from her hull, and debris littered her once pristine flight deck. Captain Elliot Buckmaster made the agonizing decision to abandon ship, ordering his crew over the side as the carrier settled deeper into the Pacific swells. But even as Yorktown began her death throes, Admiral Raymond Spruance was preparing to deliver the killing blow to the last operational Japanese carrier. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, leading the dive bombers from Yorktown that had been diverted to Enterprise after their ship was hit, stood on the carrier's bridge receiving his final briefing. The location of Hiryu had been pinpointed by reconnaissance aircraft, and Leslie's pilots, hungry for revenge after watching their home ship burning, were eager to complete the destruction of Nagumo's once mighty fleet. At 5 p.m. on June 4th, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise launched into the golden light of late afternoon. The pilots, many of them flying their second or third mission of the day, showed the exhaustion of men pushed beyond normal limits, but their determination burned as bright as the setting sun reflecting off their aircraft's wings. Leslie led his formation northwest, following the bearing provided by reconnaissance reports. The ocean below stretched endlessly in all directions, marked only by the occasional oil slick or piece of debris from the morning's carnage. Somewhere ahead lay Hiryu, the last symbol of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. Admiral Yamaguchi had used the afternoon hours well. Hiryu's damage control crews had worked miracles, keeping the carrier operational despite near misses from American bombs. The ship's remaining aircraft had been launched in the desperate attacks on Yorktown, leaving her decks nearly empty, but her crew still fighting with the fierce pride of the Imperial Navy. When lookouts spotted the approaching American dive bombers at 1700 hours, Hiryu's anti-aircraft guns opened fire immediately, the sky around the carrier filled with black puffs of explosive shells. But Leslie's pilots pressed their attack with grim determination. They had seen too many friends die that day to be deterred by defensive fire. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, the pilot who had mortally wounded Akagi that morning, led the first section down in a screaming dive toward Hiryu's flight deck. His 1,000-pound bomb struck just forward of the carrier's island, penetrating to the hangar deck where it exploded among stored aircraft and aviation fuel. The familiar pattern of destruction began, once again fire racing through the ship's interior, secondary explosions sending debris high into the air, and the acrid smell of burning metal and flesh. 3 more bombs found their mark in rapid succession, turning Hiryu into the 4th Japanese carrier to suffer fatal damage that day. Admiral Yamaguchi, watching his flagship burn around him, refused his staff's urgent pleas to abandon ship. The admiral, who had shown such aggressive leadership throughout the battle, chose to remain with his carrier, going down with the ship in the finest tradition of the Imperial Navy, as documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history of World War II. The transformation of the Pacific strategic situation in a single day was unprecedented in naval warfare. For Japanese aircraft carrier ships that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months were reduced to burning hulks in the space of 6 hours. But even as the American pilots celebrated their victory, the battle was not quite finished. Japanese surface ships still prowled the waters around Midway, and Admiral Yamamoto's massive battleship force was approaching from the west. The combined fleet commander, monitoring radio traffic from his flagship Yamato, refused to accept that his carefully planned operation had failed so catastrophically. Throughout the night of June 4th-5th, damage control crews aboard the abandoned Yorktown continued their heroic efforts. The carrier, which had been given up for lost, showed signs of stabilizing. A skeleton crew reboarded the ship, hoping to save one of America's most valuable warships. But fate had one more card to play in the deadly game unfolding across the Pacific. The Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the American fleet since dawn. Now, with Yorktown helpless and under tow, Tanabe saw an opportunity to salvage something from the disaster that had befallen the Japanese Navy. The pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1942, hung over the Pacific like a shroud as Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe peered through the periscope of his submarine I-168. For 36 hours, he had stalked the American fleet, watching in horror as 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were reduced to burning wrecks. Now, the damaged USS Yorktown lay motionless in the water ahead, a destroyer alongside attempting to take her under tow. Tanabe had graduated from the Imperial Naval Academy in the same class as many of the pilots who had died with their carriers the previous day. The submarine commander understood that the Battle of Midway had been a catastrophe for Japan, but he still had an opportunity to inflict one final blow on the American fleet. The crippled carrier represented not just military value, but symbolic importance. Saving Yorktown would be seen as a victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. Aboard Yorktown, Captain Buckmaster had returned with a skeleton crew of volunteers. Determined to save their ship, the carrier's list had been reduced to just 2 degrees, and damage control teams were making remarkable progress in restoring power and pumping out flooded compartments. The destroyer USS Hammond was secured alongside, providing electrical power and additional pumps to aid in the salvage effort. Chief Machinist Mate Harold Johnson led a damage control party deep in Yorktown's bowels, working by flashlight to shore up bulkheads and stop leaks. The ship groaned and creaked around them, but Johnson's men worked with the quiet competence of sailors who had grown up with the sea. They knew their carrier was fighting for her life, and they were determined to give her every chance. Commander Clarence Aldrich, Yorktown's damage control officer, coordinated the salvage effort from the carrier's bridge. Reports flowed in from throughout the ship as repair parties sealed compartments, restored power to critical systems, and gradually brought the wounded flattop back from the brink. The ocean around Yorktown was still littered with debris from the previous day's battle, but the carrier herself was showing signs of recovery. At 1:36 p.m., Tanabe fired a spread of 4 torpedoes from a range of 1,200 yards. The long-lance torpedoes, among the most advanced weapons in the Japanese arsenal, raced through the clear Pacific water at 49 knots, their wakeless tracks invisible to American lookouts until the final seconds before impact. The first torpedo struck Yorktown just below her island superstructure, the explosion sending a column of water and debris high into the air. The second torpedo hit further aft, flooding additional compartments and causing the carrier's list to increase dramatically. But it was the third torpedo that sealed Yorktown's fate and struck the destroyer Hammond amidships, breaking the smaller vessel's back and detonating her depth charges. In a massive secondary explosion, Chief Johnson felt the deck plates buckle beneath his feet as the torpedo explosions rippled through Yorktown's hull. Emergency lighting failed throughout the ship, plunging repair parties into darkness as seawater poured through new ruptures. In the carrier's sides, the carefully orchestrated damage control effort collapsed as men scrambled through flooding passages toward the upper decks. The destruction of Hammond was instantaneous and terrible. The destroyer's magazines detonated in a pillar of flame and smoke that rose 500 feet into the tropical sky. Debris rained down on both ships as the destroyer broke apart and sank within minutes, taking most of her crew with her into the depths. The explosion was so violent that it caused additional damage to Yorktown, rupturing previously repaired compartments and accelerating the carrier's list. Captain Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship for the second time in 2 days, but this time there would be no reprieve. Yorktown's list increased steadily as seawater flooded her lower decks, and it became clear that the great carrier was beyond saving. Sailors slid down lines into life rafts and rescue ships, watching their home disappear beneath the Pacific swells. At dawn on June 7, Yorktown rolled over and sank, her battle flag still flying from the stern as she disappeared beneath 3,000 fathoms of Pacific water. The carrier that had fought at the Coral Sea and delivered the decisive blow at Midway was gone, but her sacrifice had not been in vain. The Japanese Navy had lost 4 replaceable aircraft carriers and many of their most experienced pilots, while America had lost only 1 ship that was already heavily damaged. Lieutenant Commander Tanabe surfaced his submarine briefly to observe the results of his attack. the end of deep to escape the American destroyers racing toward his position. He had accomplished his mission, but the victory felt hollow. The rising sun that had seemed so triumphant just days before was now setting across the Pacific, and even Tanabe understood that everything had changed at Midway. The battle was over, but its consequences would echo across the Pacific for the remainder of the war. The morning sun of June 7th, 1942, cast long shadows across the bridge of USS Enterprise as Admiral Raymond Spruance stood silent, contemplating the transformed Pacific before him. The ocean that just 3 days earlier had seemed destined to become a Japanese lake now stretched toward a horizon bright with American promise. The debris of 4 enemy aircraft carriers floated on the swells like tombstones, marking the grave of Japanese naval supremacy. Captain Miles Browning, exhausted from 72 hours of continuous operations, approached his admiral with the final damage reports. The statistics told the story of one of history's most decisive naval victories. Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and over 3,000 sailors and aviators. More importantly, they had lost many of their most experienced pilots, men who had trained for years and could not be quickly replaced. America's losses, while painful, were comparatively light: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 307 brave souls. But the true magnitude of the victory at Midway extended far beyond ships and statistics. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing reports in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood that the strategic situation in the Pacific had been fundamentally altered. The Japanese advance had been not merely halted, but shattered, and for the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces held the initiative. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the dive bomber leader whose decision to follow a Japanese destroyer had led to the decisive attack on the enemy carriers, stood on Enterprise's flight deck watching recovery operations. His pilots, many flying their 3rd or 4th mission in 2 days, landed with the careful precision of men pushed beyond exhaustion but sustained by the knowledge of victory achieved. The young aviators, who had seemed so uncertain just days before now, carried themselves with the quiet confidence of proven warriors. The battle had revealed both the potential and the limitations of naval aviation. The destruction of 4 carriers in a matter of minutes demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of dive bombing attacks, while the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 highlighted the vulnerability of obsolete aircraft in modern warfare. These lessons would reshape American naval tactics for the remainder of the Pacific War. In Tokyo, the news of the defeat at Midway arrived like a physical blow to the Japanese high command. Emperor Hirohito, receiving reports in his palace, understood that the dream of Pacific domination had died with Admiral Nagumo's carriers. The carefully planned expansion that was to have secured Japan's empire for 1,000 years had been stopped cold by American determination and superior intelligence. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of both Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation, accepted full responsibility for the disaster. The man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild for 6 months before American industrial might began to tell, had seen his prediction come true with devastating precision. The combined fleet that had seemed invincible was now forced onto the defensive, never again to threaten American territory. The human cost of victory weighed heavily on the American commanders. Every name on the casualty list represented not just a statistic, but a son, brother, or father who would not return home. Ensign George Gay, sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, would carry the memory of his 15 squadron mates for the rest of his life. Their sacrifice had not been in vain, but the price of victory in the Pacific would always be measured in the lives of such men. As Enterprise turned toward Pearl Harbor, her battle flags flying proudly in the trade winds, Admiral Spruance reflected on the lessons of Midway. American industrial capacity and technological innovation had proven decisive, but victory had ultimately depended on the courage of individual sailors and aviators willing to press home their attacks despite overwhelming odds. The battle had demonstrated that wars are won not by grand strategies alone, but by the accumulated acts of heroism performed by ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. The Pacific War would continue for 3 more years, but historians would always mark Midway as the turning point where American victory became inevitable. The rising sun that had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor was finally setting, while a new dawn broke across the vast ocean that would soon become an American lake. The fight that had begun with a surprise attack on a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii was now turning toward its ultimate conclusion in Tokyo Bay, on the empty waters where 4 Japanese carriers had burned. The Pacific swells continued their eternal rhythm, washing away the debris of battle, but never erasing the memory of the men who had fought and died to secure America's victory at Midway.